On Hirohito, Japanese head of state during World War II, Adolf Hitler said this: "The Japanese emperor is a companion piece for the late Tsars of Russia. He is weak, cowardly, and irresolute, and may easily be toppled by revolution." There was no communist revolution in Japan, no military overthrow either, but there was World War II. And though Hitler's critiques are brimming with characteristic contempt and belligerence, the idea of a gentle, peace-loving constitutional monarch who was merely a victim of an ultranationalist military does appear to be the common view. What was this enigmatic figure like in person? What was his actual role during the war? And how does this reflect on him as a man? Before we delve into our character breakdown, as usual, let's get that bio in. Alicia, hit the clock. Little Hirohito was born on the 29th of April 1901 in Tokyo's Imperial Aoyama Palace. At the time of his birth, his grandfather, the great Emperor Meiji, sat on the chrysanthemum throne. Meiji is a pivotal figure in Japan as he presided over one of the most remarkable national revamps in recorded history. Under his reign, Japan went from a quasi-feudal state, isolated from the world for nearly 250 years, to an economic and industrial powerhouse, adopting Western institutions and developing a military giant that defeated both China and the Russian Empire within the first half-century of its inception. Emperor Meiji made sure his grandchild, the offspring of his son and heir Yoshihito, had a superb education under some of the greatest minds in Japan. Hirohito was coddled, fussed over, and reared in court splendor. One day, he would become head of state, and as per the new Meiji Constitution of 1889, head of the armed forces. On Meiji's much-lamented death in July 1912, Yoshihito ascended the throne. Though an able statesman, Yoshihito lacked charisma and wasn't particularly articulate. More damagingly, he had contracted cerebral meningitis within 3 weeks of birth, affecting his mental and physical fitness. His rapid deterioration in adulthood and seeming disinterest in state affairs prompted imperial officials and the government to prepare for Hirohito's succession sooner rather than later. The Crown Prince's education remained intensive. In 1921, the 20-year-old was sent on a 5-month tour of Europe. Although the trip was partly for diplomatic reasons, it was more of a character-building opportunity for the anxious and sheltered young man, and a chance to further his political and military education. By November of that same year, Yoshihito's state of health was so severe that Hirohito was sworn in as Prince Regent to act in his stead. His regency years saw the Great Kanto earthquake in September 1923, Japan's deadliest natural disaster in recorded history. A month later, Hirohito survived an assassination attempt by radical communist Daisuke Namba. It would be the first of 3 attempts, with others to follow in 1925 and 1932. On the international scene, Japan had reached global power status. It was a key member of the League of Nations, upholding world peace in the aftermath of World War I. Japan was also a signatory to various international treaties throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, such as the Washington Naval Conference, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and the London Naval Treaty, which aimed to limit military and naval buildups, promote diplomacy and collective security, and generally prevent war. These treaties would become a source of friction with the Japanese army, an increasingly assertive, anti-Western force which harbored desires for expansion in Asia, particularly in China. In 1924, Hirohito married Princess Nagako, a distant cousin with whom he would bear 2 sons and 5 daughters. In December 1926, Yoshihito died aged 47, and Hirohito became Emperor of Japan. From there on, Hirohito presided over a divided country, divided over the symbolic role of the emperor with its people, over relations with the Western colonial powers, over military and naval rearmament, geostrategic expansion in Asia and Siberia, and various other polarizing topics. Brewing tensions with the Republic of China bubbled over with the Japanese invasion of the northeast Chinese region of Manchuria in September 1931, which would later become the puppet state of Manchukuo. Japan's brazen attack, occupation, and subsequent expansion within China brought the empire into conflict with the West. In March 1933, the League of Nations refused to recognize Manchukuo, prompting Japan to leave the organization. A dangerous zeitgeist gripped Japan in the 1930s, one which was decades, arguably centuries in the making. It came in the forms of ultranationalism, racism, and aggressive militarism. A generation of schoolchildren had been indoctrinated into the belief Japan was a sacred land, populated by a master race, ruled over by a demigod who could trace his lineage to the sun goddess Amaterasu. Threatening this land and its people were wicked imperialist powers from the West, the birthplace of such dangerous ideas as liberalism or communism. Therefore, breaches of international treaties and acts of hostility could be justified by claims of the West's imperialist hypocrisy or Japan's need to protect its sphere of influence, to protect weaker Asian races from foreign encroachment, on top of an overarching certainty in the purity and superiority of the Japanese race. Though this ideology, often referred to as the Emperor System or Japanese fascism, intensified over the 1930s, it was staggered and far from unified. The army was divided internally, the navy was divided from the army. Even if the direction of the state was dangerous, there was often very little consensus, like a zigzagging stampede towards a cliff edge. The perceived failure of the government to deal with the socio-economic consequences of the Great Depression was also a polarizing matter. The emperor himself was often the center of these points of contention. His symbolic role in the state and his relationship with his subjects, for example. State officials wanted to know what the national essence of Japan was, the kokutai. The country had modernized so quickly along Western lines, yet had clung on to a centuries-old monarchy with supposedly divine origins. How could the state reconcile modernity and tradition? The more aggressive political faction within the army was called the Kodo-ha. They wanted a military government, totalitarian rule with the emperor at the helm that would expand the Japanese empire. On the 26th of February 1936, junior officers of this Kodo-ha faction staged a coup, hoping to assassinate senior government officials, including the Prime Minister. They also wanted the emperor to clarify this notion of the national essence. In any case, it would have to be compatible with the military regime they hoped to establish. While many in the military actually supported the coup, the emperor ordered the mutiny's suppression. The rebels surrendered 3 days after, on the 29th of February, a surprisingly long time for reasons we'll delve into later. Though the radical faction lost its political influence, massive rearmament still followed thereafter, in breach of international treaties. The next few years are well known to the history enthusiast, and if you'll excuse a pun in bad taste, we'll blitz through the main events. 1936 and 1937, Japanese rapprochement with the fascist powers, Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy. July 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident leads to all-out war with China. The major city of Nanjing falls in December, unleashing a 6-week orgiastic bloodbath by Japanese troops, infamously known as the Rape of Nanjing. September 1939, Hitler invades Poland, starting World War II in Europe. July 1940, to punish Japanese expansionism in French Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, the US freezes Japanese foreign assets and places an oil and gasoline embargo, cutting off over 80% of its oil supply. September 1940, Japan invades French Indochina. Nazi-occupied France becomes puppet ruler to Japan. Later that same month, Japan allies with Germany and Italy, signing the Tripartite Act, an act of mutual assistance in war. December 1941, Japan launches a surprise preemptive attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, while simultaneously invading Allied-held colonies in the West Pacific. The US enters the war, engaging the Japanese Navy in the Pacific. The Battle of Midway between the US and Japanese navies in June 1942 decimates Japanese naval power, paving the way for the liberation of Japanese-occupied territories in the West Pacific with the help of Allied forces. Meanwhile, the war in China still rages. Bloody battles on Japanese territories follow, each resulting in an Allied victory. Infamously, the Battle of Iwo Jima from February to March 1945, the Battle of Okinawa from April to June 1945, followed by devastating aerial bombardments on Tokyo and other Japanese cities. On the 26th of July, the Potsdam Declaration is issued to Japan, an Allied ultimatum to surrender, and failing that, to expect, quote, prompt and utter destruction. In the absence of a surrender, the US drops nuclear bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, on the 6th and 9th of August 1945. Hirohito takes charge of the armed forces and declares the formal surrender of Japan on the 15th of August. The Tokyo War Crimes trial, Asia's Nuremberg, leads to charges for 28 senior members of Japan's military and political leadership, including former prime ministers, foreign ministers, and military commanders. 7 of these were executed, 16 were jailed for life. So, what was Hirohito's role in the armed war? He was head of state and leader of the armed forces. He was therefore extremely well briefed and sanctioned the vast majority of war acts, many of which he discussed and planned with cabinet and military officials. The exact extent of his influence in decision-making and his constitutional powers are hotly debated. Was he a war criminal? More on this later. In any case, Hirohito and the imperial family were exempt from prosecution. The man behind this decision was General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in charge of the US-led occupation of Japan. The rationale was that Hirohito and the imperial family generally were a vital symbol of Japanese unity, without whom it was feared Japanese morale would be crippled. And given the decimated state of Japan, it needed all the morale it could get in order to rebuild and rejoin the world of nations. On the 1st of January 1946, in a public statement, Hirohito was forced to renounce his divine status, a huge nail on the coffin for state Shinto. This is the term often used to describe the ultranationalist system which developed in Japan, centering around the emperor and Japan's indigenous religion, Shinto. A new democratic and liberal constitution was drafted, under which the emperor lost his political and military powers, instead becoming, quote, the symbol of the state and of the unity of the people. From this point onwards, Hirohito became little more than a figurehead. He had a strong public presence, making public appearances with the empress at ceremonies and special events. Still worshipped by many Japanese people, his public appearances brought adulating crowds to tears. A particularly emotional post-war event was a public visit to Hiroshima in 1947, where he delivered a speech to enormous crowds. But these appearances served to humanize the emperor. Now no longer an incarnate divinity, he could be seen smiling in public. The Japanese people had only heard his voice for the first time in his surrender speech from August 1945. Until then, most people had only seen one picture of their emperor, and it was of his bust. Hirohito's touring, along with the publication of pictures and stories of his personal and family life, made him extremely popular and helped preserve the imperial throne. On the world stage, his image was also generally positive. He went on various state visits, meeting world leaders from what were once enemy states to rehabilitate Japan's image. In 1971, he broke a tradition when he toured Europe and became the first reigning monarch to visit abroad. That same year, he also became the first emperor to meet a US president and the first to visit the US. 4 years later, he made another goodwill visit to meet President Ford, and in a highly publicized event, visited Disneyland, even doing a walkabout with Mickey Mouse. In his own time, he occupied himself with his lifelong passion for marine biology or indulging in horse riding, tennis, and golf. In 1989, aged 87, Hirohito died of cancer in his small intestine. Spanning 62 years, the Showa era made Hirohito the longest reigning monarch in Japanese history to date. He was succeeded by his son Akihito. The matter of Hirohito's war responsibility is extremely contentious. It's widely held Hirohito's exoneration by Allied occupation forces was politically motivated, and that his legal responsibility in Japan's war crimes is undeniable. It is the extent of his constitutional powers during wartime which is the major point of dispute, throwing his moral responsibility into question. We'll be exploring this later. For now, let's take a look at the man himself. What shaped this enigmatic man, and who was he in the flesh? Hirohito wasn't what you'd call a typically charismatic leader. After the Japanese surrender, the Showa emperor, who for years was seen and treated as a living god, this enigmatic figure behind a veil of mystical power, was finally in the public eye. On the 26th of March 1946, the emperor was visiting a hospital for wounded war victims in Takasaki City. American journalist Mark Gain, present at the scene, left us with this incredibly vivid account, which I'll attempt to imitate in my bestest American accent. I had a good look at the emperor. or Charlie, as we called him. He is a little man, about 5 foot 2 inches in height, in a badly cut grey striped suit, with trousers a couple of inches too short. He has a pronounced facial tic, and his right shoulder twitches constantly. When he walks, he throws his right leg a little sideways, as if he has no control over it. At first, he shuffled past the men, stopping occasionally to read the charts. Then he apparently decided the moment called for a few words. He tried several questions, but they all seemed out of place. At last, he settled on the simple, "Where are you from?" He now walked from man to man, asked his question, and when the patient answered, the emperor said, "Ah, so." He sounded as if he were surprised to learn that the man had come from Akita or Wakayama or the Hokkaido. His voice was high-pitched, and as time passed, it grew thinner and higher. The irreverent Americans were now all waiting for the inhuman sound of, "Ah, so." And when it came, they nudged each other and laughed and mimicked the sound. But the joke wore out. We could now see the emperor for what he was, a tired, pathetic little man, compelled to do a job distasteful to him and trying desperately to control his disobedient voice and face and body. It was hot and hushed, and there were no sounds other than the emperor's shrill voice and the heavy breathing of his escorts. Not a particularly flattering portrait, I'm sure you'll agree, but putting aside this biased account, brimming with post-war resentment, how could this gentle, socially awkward man who seemed so uncomfortable in his skin have been complicit in the atrocities of the Sino-Japanese War and the War of the Pacific? He was hardly made of the same stuff as the rabid Hitler or Stalin Man of Steel. He must have been a puppet to some violent, racist, ultranationalist military who sent the country on a nosedive into the abyss, surely. So let's take a look at how this Hirohito came about, shall we? Baby Hirohito, oh isn't he sweet, was by the account of his wet nurse, calm, sedate, and really quite uncomplicated, certainly compared with his unruly younger brother, Chichibu, who required much more attention but was also more curious than Hirohito. Throughout his childhood, Hirohito was pampered in the manner you'd expect for a prince of an archaic ruling dynasty. As was the tradition, he lived in a separate house from his parents, even though he visited his father daily. Nurses and house staff tended to his every need, and his teachers carefully reported on his learning. And it would have been clear from an early age just how important he was. Hirohito's childhood resembles a goldfish bowl. As he grew older and his education became more intensive, so too did the constant glare over his development. Rearing would be the word for it. Rearing for a life of statecraft and imperial rule, as a living deity and as the head of the Shinto faith. Thus he was imbued with the Shinto creation myths from an early age, and would often visit the imperial family's shrines. His school was run by a certain General Nogi Marisuka, a hero of the Russo-Japanese War, who was personally handpicked by Emperor Meiji to act as tutor to the young boy, along with a handful of sons of other state officials. Other boys, not yet 4 or 5 years old, lined up and bowed to the prince at various intervals during the day, addressing him as Prince while he called them by their surnames. During play with his peers in make-believe war games, he always had to be Commander-in-Chief, on the winning side. You wouldn't get away with insulting, slighting, or harming him. His brother, Chichibu, once made the mistake of hitting Hirohito with a toy artillery piece. A horrified maid standing nearby immediately whisked Chichibu off to the prayer room, where he was forced to apologize before images of the sun goddess and his parents, the crown prince and princess. He was then forced to swear to the gods that he would never hit his brother again. Basically, this shy, taciturn boy was treated as a living god. This treatment, and his own reticence, would have affected his ability to have normal relationships with his peers. His Spartan education would have made this even more difficult. The average school day in his early years started around 6 o'clock in the morning and ended at 9:30 in the evening. His education would be more personalized as he grew up, but exposure to peers was still limited. His brothers would have been his main companions. One also wonders the weight of knowing that he one day would have to take on the imperial mantle. His grandfather, Emperor Meiji, was a profoundly admired figure in Japanese court circles. Hirohito's tutors, particularly historians, praised him to the point of distortion. Hirohito grew up in awe of the man, knowing one day he would have big shoes to fill, but perhaps not knowing how unrealistic the standard was given how much the man had been mythologized. His own father's physical and mental degeneration might have lowered the bar for his own rule, though it might also have added on more pressure to redeem the imperial throne and title, following in his grandfather's footsteps. As he grew older, there was certainly a mismatch between the expectations cabinet ministers and imperial staff had of him and the actual Hirohito. Though studious and gifted with an excellent memory, his performance in school, his essays and pace of learning, all always closely monitored by his mentors, were just above average, and his tutors often lamented a lack of creativity and independence of thought. His mother, Empress Teimei, often fretted over his nervousness, at a stage when Hirohito was particularly fond of athletics. Though not especially gifted in team sports, she wished him to train his mind more than his body, believing that his exercise wasn't helping his nerves. During his adolescence, courtiers and government officials worried about his public presence. It wasn't just his unimpressive physique, his small size, limp, round shoulders, or his high-pitched voice. More crucially, it was his perceived lack of intellectual curiosity and poor conversation skills. One field marshal, who had a private audience with the emperor, said this: "He seems just like a stone statue. This is very regrettable and must be due to his overprotective education. Hereafter, we must encourage the Crown Prince to become more active and free-spirited by affording him a more open education." Hirohito's sheltered education would become a regular point of contention, and it became clear the emperor needed a more open and interactive education, allowing him to see the world. Hence the importance of his 5-month trip to Europe in 1921, which to the 20-year-old Hirohito would be something of a bucket of ice water to the face. He was finally seeing some of the real world that many of his mentors so desperately wanted for him. In his memoirs, he recalled his trip to Britain as one of the happiest events of his life, which left him with a lifelong penchant for traditional full English breakfasts and afternoon tea. In Europe especially, his patent gawkiness was cause for worry. Prime Minister Hara Takashi ordered a minister, "Regarding the Crown Prince's habits, such as his frequent body movements, I want everyone in attendance close to him to correct this. I also observed that he is unfamiliar with Western table manners. I want someone to instruct him very carefully in this too." Just 4 days after his return, one Japanese diplomat wrote, "It seems as though the shortcomings in the prince's qualities of character are insufficient calmness and a lack of intellectual curiosity." Most remained optimistic that he would improve, and he did. But it's true that his reserve would stay with him for life. He was scholarly and self-effacing, though hardly a passive figure in state affairs, as we'll see later. It wasn't uncommon during meetings with his cabinet for the emperor to remain completely quiet throughout the whole session. Advisors and cabinet members would learn to carefully read his facial expressions to grasp his position on matters. They'd pay close attention to his limited individual words, spoken in an archaic dialect used almost exclusively by members of the imperial family. Historian Herbert Bix wonders whether Hirohito's natural reticence was something he acquired as a tactic to fend off the pampering and pedantry during his development, quote, shielding himself from the intrusive gaze of his pedagogues. He might later even find comfort in this to fit the historical archetype of the taciturn monarch, compatible with Confucian and Japanese political culture and aesthetic. As a living god, he wasn't expected to smile, for example. His movements, speech, and expressions were expected to be serene, imbued with a godlike spirit that could keep a nation calm and united. Hence the preoccupation with his many twitches, noted by the American journalist quoted earlier. And this was the imperial burden, something which we should always bear in mind for all dynastic rulers in history. Hirohito grew up knowing he would one day inherit the throne, and was forced to grow up very quickly. Did he want it? We didn't have a choice in the matter, certainly, but did he ever reflect on his completely limited agency in life? Though outwardly unemotional by necessity, he wasn't unemotional himself. He developed the habit, noted by many of his chamberlains, of talking to himself while under stress, something which only intensified with age. He more than likely grew up emotionally lonely, said to have kept a diary from the age of 11 until the end of his life. We don't have access to his diaries, closed off by the Imperial Household Agency, but what inner thoughts would the historian be privy to upon their recovery? Whatever Hirohito's behaviours were, which led to charges of intellectual closed-mindedness, they must have been short-lived or more probably misleading. A rigorous education and a highly detail-oriented personality left him with a lifelong insistence on, perhaps even an insatiable need for, knowledge. The Emperor's insistence on data gathering and frequent briefing was legendary in Japan's ruling circles. He would never sanction anything until he had carefully sifted through all the relevant information and considered all aspects and details of the matter, not least their repercussions. We have many records of conversations during private meetings, left to us chiefly through the diaries of cabinet ministers, in which Hirohito sought out obscure, missing data or asked all sorts of highly technical questions about tactics, indicating deep prior evaluation and thought. Highly cautious by nature, he would inquire about the likelihood of success or insist on making contingency plans. Throughout much of the 1930s and into the 1940s, he worried a lot about the risk of provoking the USSR and the US into war. The attack on Pearl Harbor was an indication of how much the domestic and international situation had escalated for him to sanction the strike. Though his caution and attention to detail aren't necessarily unwelcome in a leader, his more hot-headed advisors would easily have considered his caution as pedantry or indecisiveness. There might have been an element of this at times. He wasn't perhaps always the most incisive of commanders-in-chief when orders needed to be sanctioned. What we find from many of the conversations is a leader asking poignant questions, then receiving evasive, cryptic, or simply vague answers. More surprising is Hirohito's frequent tolerance of the imprecision. For a man as meticulous as he was extremely patient. Perhaps he wasn't always aware of the staggering levels of incompetence and recklessness both in the government and the military. This sense that he could take his time with things as long as he could see the full picture was a source of frustration for many. One general went so far as to make the cynical suggestion that a leading factor in Japan's defeat in World War II was the amount of energy and time invested in keeping the emperor briefed, instead of focusing on long-term strategy. But this insistence on prudent data collection wasn't just out of respect for his office, which he did take extremely seriously. He extended this to his personal life and self-development. Throughout his entire life, he would have academics from various fields give him lectures in the Imperial Palace, be they on politics, international affairs, history, science, or military studies, even if the knowledge wasn't necessary for his office. After the birth of his first child, Shigeko, in 1925, he did something really quite unique for the era. He arranged a series of court lectures for him and his wife Nagako on child psychology and parenthood. Perhaps as a result of these lectures, he broke with imperial tradition by insisting Shigeko spend her first 3 years not in a separate home being breastfed and raised by chamberlains, but under the care of Hirohito and Nagako in the imperial palace. He refused to have wet nurses and massively reduced the number of ladies-in-waiting in the service of the princess. Considering his own upbringing, it's no wonder he pushed for a much clearer divide between his public and private lives. Perhaps the best indication of his methodical mind was his lifelong passion for natural history, and especially marine biology. It's perhaps to no surprise that a boy as sheltered as the young Hirohito would develop a fascination for the natural world, outside the proverbial gilded cage. At age 12, a school study on wildflowers piqued Hirohito's interest. Around the same time, he had started collecting shells and insects with his little brother. By age 13, he had created his own book of insect specimens. That year, he was also presented with a huge seashell collection by a hobbyist, which had left him so enamored he resolved to mount his own official collection. Before long, the prince was introduced to Hirotaro Hattori, his new natural history and physics teacher. This learned and equally methodical man would leave a permanent mark on Hirohito's mind, and for over 30 years was his point of reference for most scientific matters, greatly nurturing his passion for the natural world. And so it was that a teenage passion flowered into a lifelong endeavour. This was no hobbyist. Here are the words of a fellow British botanist named E.J.H. who met and worked with Hirohito. Firstly, in scientific erudition, he made himself in the course of 40 years an international authority on the group of lowly marine animals, the hydrozoa. Their study called for acute, perception, and great patience to master the microscopic details of their construction. Secondly, he carried out the first comprehensive biological survey of the Great Sagami Bay by means of shore collecting, trawling, and dredging to depths of 500 meters. He amassed such immense collections of marine animals and seaweeds, all meticulously annotated in regard to habitat, that many specialists in Japan and from overseas were required for their identification. In the course of this work, over 300 new species were brought to light and many new records for Japan. On the matter of his work on hydrozoa, tiny predatory animals, mainly living in salt water and related to jellyfish and coral, another eminent biologist, Dr. Frederick M. Bayer, from the Smithsonian Institution, wrote this: "From a scientific standpoint, these are among the more difficult animals to study and classify, because many of them have elaborate life cycles that include two vastly dissimilar generations, each of which historically has been named and classified independently. It is a tribute to his scientific determination and skill that he has pursued the difficult study of these perplexing organisms with exceptional success, and has published the results under his own name." Hirohito would dredge, explore, and study for the rest of his life, involved in a plethora of international studies. By 1927, he had named over 6,000 collections of animals and plants. By his death in 1989, the figure hovered around 57,000. Needless to say, for us ignorant plebs, that is a lot of hours dredging, exploring, observing under the microscope, analysing, classifying, studying, etc. Certainly a superb memory would have served him well in this field. Dr. Corner also notes his extensive knowledge far beyond the scope of his own research. Named a Fellow of the British Royal Society in 1971, it does beg the question, what more could this man have done had he not inherited the chrysanthemum throne? So, well done Hirohito, a gentleman and a scholar. Throughout his life, science would remain a grounding, quote, relaxing constant, to borrow Bix's words. Taxonomy, especially during the chaos and stressful responsibilities of the war, was a calming hobby that satisfied a love of nature, but also a regimented, analytical mind wired for orderliness. He would also take great pleasure in exhibiting his collections to his ministers and courtiers, often lecturing in the evenings. Besides taxonomy, golf, tennis, cards, Japanese chess, and horse riding were also some of the emperor's favourite pastimes. He had a keen interest in sumo wrestling. Though more a scientist than an artist, he wrote and read poetry throughout life. Later, a more elderly Hirohito would insist on walking every day, either through the imperial gardens or in the woodlands and bays surrounding the imperial country villas. He considered the outdoor life of the naturalist was good for the health, a source of botanical diversion, but also of mental peace. The Empress, his lifelong companion from the age of 22, was also a keen botanist with a personal collection, but also an artist who was particularly skilled at painting flowers in classical style. With everything we've learned so far about Hirohito, it seems odd to think that this serene, rational-minded man could have been involved in or responsible for such atrocities as the rape of Nanjing, or the Bataan Death March, or such shocking displays of brazen militarism as with the Marco Polo incident or the attack on Pearl Harbor. This was no Stalin, no Hitler, no Mussolini. I mean, look at him. Surely he was innocent.